Welcome to the CU 2.0 podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the CU 2.0 podcast with big new ideas about credit unions and conversations about innovative technology with credit union and fintech leaders. This podcast is brought to you by Quillo, the real-time loan syndication network for credit unions, and by your host, longtime credit union and financial technology journalist Robert McGarvey. And now, the CU 2.0 podcast with Robert McGarvey.
Risk. For years, I have said that to a credit union senior executive, the foulest four-letter word is risk. R-I-S-K, 4 letters. It's a risk-averse industry. And that's a paradox because a credit union makes money by taking risks. Then, too, we're now in a universe of unprecedented risk. There are wars, threats of a recession, threats of uncontrolled inflation. Of course, there now is so much competition, neobanks, non-banks, and more. Risks are everywhere. Enter Ed Vincent, CEO of SRA Watchtower, a Virginia-headquartered company with a toolkit that's designed to automate risk management for credit unions. Quote, SRA Watchtower is committed to helping financial institutions unlock the power of data, which we believe is the currency of the future, said Vincent. You know you're in a sea of risks. Know that SRA Watchtower knows that, and that is why it has tools to help credit unions manage in today's environment. Listen up.
So you help credit unions with risk. What kind of risk and what pain point prompts them to want to talk to you?
It's a great question. And risk, I think, has had maybe got a bum rap over the years. But the reality is, I think in any financial institution, this is fundamentally, right, how you make money as a credit union, right? It's risk and reward, right? There are two dimensions, right? You can't achieve the reward, you can't achieve that outcome, you can't achieve the financial success unless you take risk. Now, risk without thought and pursued in a haphazard manner is obviously dangerous. And so what we aim to do with Watchtower is help institutions look at risk holistically. We call that enterprise risk management. That is maybe not a brand new concept for folks, but it still is not necessarily practiced consistently. So helping institutions understand a holistic picture of risk allows them then to make better risk-informed decisions.
Now, I've said for some years that the dirtiest 4-letter word in a credit union executive's vocabulary is not any of the ones you might think of. It's risk. They despise risk, which is paradoxical because, as you're right, the essence of the business is making some money by taking smart risks. And if you look at Chase takes risks, like taking over Silicon Valley Bank. There was some risk involved in that. But Jamie Dimon rolled the dice and said, hey, even if it busts out, we could still come back to the table. We're okay. We're fine. It's credit union people get weird when a risk goes south.
Well, I think I think we all think of it right in our personal lives as well, right? We all have different appetites for risk. And so I think that there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer as to where you are on that spectrum, Robert. I think the key is, though, understanding where you are on the spectrum and acknowledging that. And ideally then measuring, right, what the risk appetite of your institution is versus what your behavior is. And so it's not that risk is good or bad. Risk exists. It's how much do you want to take? And then are you in fact tracking it and monitoring it and making sure that the risks you are taking are within those boundaries, within those guideposts, within that risk appetite, those risk appetite parameters.
Okay, let's define the type of risk you're dealing with. I was thinking before this call, if I'm a credit union CEO, particularly at a big institution, I'm thinking about risks like, will I lose my federal tax exemption? Will NCUA be dismantled? Well, you're getting the picture there. Will we enter a recession? And on Sunday on the Bartiromo show on Fox, Trump refused to rule out that there'd be a recession as a consequence of tariffs. He claimed it would be short-lived, but he refused to rule it out. Now, these would all be big risks that I'd be thinking about. Is that the kind of risk you're talking about?
Absolutely. Those certainly are some of the risks. when we sit down with a credit union, we come to the table and say, we've got 7 categories of risk: credit, strategic, operational, interest rate, liquidity, compliance, reputational. So there's a number of large categories, and the things that you mentioned in some way, shape, or form will fit into those categories. But we counsel the institution to try and start with something that you can get your hands around, because there are hundreds and hundreds of risks out there, right? I gave you 7 categories. You can drill down. You could have 100, 200, 300 individual, micro level risks. And so what we start out with is we say, look, here's kind of 40 to 50 key risk indicators, the things that you'd want to measure or monitor. Some of them are within your control. Some of them perhaps are not within your control, right? The macroeconomic environment, which you mentioned, not necessarily within your control, certainly something you still want to be aware of, though. There's other things that are more within your control. Operational risk or concentration of credit, for example. You have to quantify all those, and you want to look at that holistically. And so I think that the starting out point is saying, get out of the starting gate, define what is a universe of risks that you want to wrap your head around, and then monitor those. And then over time, you'll find that either some of them are less applicable, some of them are more applicable, or other risks pop up. And then you can add those in, or you could subtract from your universe. But I think the key is to get started. And that goes back to your earlier question of kind of where are credit unions on this journey. Some of them have gotten going, others are not yet using tools and systems, but everyone's thinking about risk. It's just where they are on that maturity scale of really quantifying it and then monitoring it.
Okay, so the ones that are not using tools and systems, how are they monitoring risk? Is it you just sit there in the morning over coffee saying, man, I'm really worried about what happened in the stock market yesterday?
Yeah.
That's not a systematic way of monitoring risk.
It's not. You're absolutely right. But it's where everyone begins on this journey. And right, you'll have an institution that'll start by jotting stuff down on a notepad. Then they'll put it into a spreadsheet. Then maybe they're going to put it onto a shared file. Then they're going to say, all right, I want something that's a bit more robust, a bit more sophisticated, something where I can track auditability. Who is updating this information? Where did it come from? I would like to track it over time. I'd like to be able to share some of this with my regulatory partners or with my enterprise risk committee. And so you'll kind of take steps towards getting systems. And right, some would argue that having it on a piece of paper, that's your first step of getting it into a systematic way of capturing it. And then you get to more sophisticated ways over time.
So tell me, your company's business is software that monitors risk. How does this work?
It works. I'm going to go give you a quick history lesson, if you will, as to how we got to where we're at. We had a handful of consultants that were helping institutions set up their risk programs coming out of the financial crisis, right? Almost 20 years ago now. And then those institutions, after they understood the parameters of what their risk programs wanted to entail and encompass, they said, we'd like to now have some tools to monitor our risk programs on an ongoing basis. And so it simply put was born out of helping people define and design what their risk programs look like, and then them asking for some tools to help them do that. And so we began from the top down, from the top of the house, starting with at that risk management level and looking down into the organization, looking at all the siloed risks that are out there and aggregating it up so that risk officer or the CEO or the board risk committee has that holistic top-down view. So I think that's the key here, is getting a holistic view and then being able to really look at it from the top down.
How does the process start with a credit union?
So
what are the steps, and how painful is it? Is it like root canal, or is it easier?
Hopefully it's not entirely like going to the dentist, but we try and make it as painless as possible, right? We start with a set of predefined key risk indicators, right? to your point, right, you want to try and remove as many impediments as possible to get people going. And so what we'll, based on our experience, we've said that we've got 50 or so key risk indicators to get you started. We've got those pre-configured in a software package that is then pre-populated with data that comes out of your Form 5300, your call report that's filed with the NCUA. And that gives you a jumping off point. That gives you a set of risk indicators. The majority of those are pre-populated and pre-calculated. There's a handful of other data points that we recommend getting out of your HR system or your ALCO system. And that then gives you a starting point, kind of round one, if you will. And then you start building from there. And you say, all right, I would like to, there are some other risk indicators that are particularly relevant to my institution because I concentrate on a certain product line or asset type, or I've got a certain level of concentration. And so you can then add your own additional risk indicators, personalize them, if you will. And then you can take further steps forward and say, instead of pulling data from a call report, I want to connect into my core or my GL system. So that gives you more timely information. We consider that the step where you move from hindsight to insight, hindsight being backward looking, insight being more timely data. And then ultimately, you may connect in with your budgeting or your forecasting system. And you'll use our scenarios to say, what's going to happen in the future? And how can I plan for that? And that's foresight. So it's a crawl, walk, run approach, right? Hindsight, insight, foresight, right? Step one, got to get out of the starting gate. Step two, a bit more timely information. And then step three, starting to be forward looking.
Now, risk is often not necessarily a black and white phenomenon. In other words, what I think is risk, you might think isn't risk. I'll give you a case of a very big credit union that had a very long battle with NCUA because NCUA thought the credit union was way over concentrated in its assets and mortgages in a particular state. And the credit union basically said, go pound sand. We're very happy with this portfolio. We're not changing it. Both sides had some points in their favor, I think. But this was, one side said there's too much risk here. The other side saying, I don't see any risk.
Well, you've hit on a concept that you can argue, right? You said it there. Both sides might have a valid point. You could argue if you were asked to argue either side, you probably could, or at least you'd give it a good shot.
And if you were a high school debater, you did.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, right. That's right. Yeah, that was exactly right.
Sometimes they would tell you had to switch sides.
Yes, right. And so that's really, I think, where we land is that there is not a right or wrong answer. What there is, though, is transparency and visibility and quantification of risk. And so what we don't aim to tell you whether it's right or wrong. What we aim to do is we aim to help you quantify the risk that your institution is taking. So that's based upon the actual data itself, right? That says, well, we did this or we are doing this. And then comparing that to your risk appetite as an institution, right? Which will be informed by, peer benchmarks, your guideposts that are improved by your board risk committee, your risk appetite statement. And then that equips you to have the conversation with the regulator to say, right, what you really want is you really want to have visibility into how much risk I am taking and whether or not that's within the boundaries that I can tolerate. You can then have an argument with the regulator as to whether those boundaries are acceptable or suitable, and you can compare those to peer benchmarks and so on and so forth. It's really not a question of whether the institution is right or wrong or taking too much or not enough risk or whether it's problematic or not. It's really about saying, let's quantify the situation, and then we can have a conversation with the regulator. So that's why I go back to kind of the first point on this, which is risk exists in silos across the organization, right? A strong, robust enterprise risk management program breaks down those silos, brings all that information together so you have a holistic picture of risk. Then you can have the thoughtful conversation with the regulator.
Can this tool be used? A very common question in credit union boards boardrooms these days. It's, should we merge with this other credit union? Would this tool be able to do some analysis on that question?
Now you're getting into, I mentioned the hindsight, which is the backward looking view, the insight, which is the current view, and the foresight, which is the forward looking view. You're talking about one of the foresight scenarios, right? Which is, I want to anticipate something that might happen in the future, whether that is a macroeconomic situation, whether it is a changing in our risk profile, an injection of capital, or whether it's an M&A situation where you say, I would like to consider this scenario, right? What if my financials look like this and my risk appetite look like that, right? What would that scenario yield? So yes, that is one of the use cases of that foresight scenario, is saying, do I want to merge with or acquire another credit union? Maybe I want to acquire a bank, right? If we're going to do something that is in vogue these days. And so yes, you want to be able to model the financial side, but also model the risk side. That certainly is going to be a question that the regulators ask you when you go and you put your M&A proposition in front of them for approval.
Now, how much effort is required on the credit union's part?
Historically, right, one of the impediments to having a robust enterprise risk management program or view was the fact that all of this data and information exists in silos inside an organization. The first step was to get all that information and aggregate it up at the top of the house. That is inherently a pretty laborious process if all of these elements of risk are operating in silos. And so one of the things that we worked to do really early on was to try and automate as much of that data ingestion and aggregation as possible. And so you want to make that process of data collection to be ideally as seamless as you can, as less intrusive or least intrusive as possible. By going out to everyone across your organization and asking them to sit down with you for a 1-hour conversation while you write down notes on a scratch pad is going to be costly and intrusive. And so ideally what you would do is you would pull information as much as possible from existing systems, right? We refer to them as point solutions. Your BSA system, your fraud system, your AML system, your ALCO data, your GRC system, your vendor management program, your operational risk systems. All of that information is captured somewhere else. So by going and asking someone to pull that information out, to sit down, conduct an interview, or key that in by hand, that you're already creating impediments and friction inside the organization. And so the key there is to try and automate that as much as possible. Connect your central repository to as many of those point solutions as possible. It starts, I mentioned to you earlier there, Robert, it starts with a call report. You pull that data in programmatically from the NCUA site. Bang, you've got a large amount of data there. Alternatively, you connect to a core or a GL system and you pull that data in programmatically. Or you connect to one of those point solutions that I mentioned and you pull that data in programmatically. So ideally, you would have it be as least intrusive as possible for each of those individual stakeholders that are the owners of that data. It's why we acquired a business recently that has some really great data ingestion capabilities. They had connections to more than 20 different core and GL systems and other point solutions, so that we can go to a credit union and say, yes, we can pull that data in from your ALCO report or your BSA report, and we can do that programmatically. So I think that is one of the keys, is to avoid that impediment, and then you can spend your time evaluating the data, looking at the results and the outcomes, instead of spending your time walking around and collecting the data. So that's the biggest point of friction or impediment or challenge, is getting the data into one place to start.
And my guess is, and your job is to tell me if I'm right or wrong, is that the biggest institutions are already pretty comfortable with looking at risk and do it routinely. You go down to a mid-sized credit union and, hey man, I just don't got time for this. But what are you talking about? maybe Navy Federal does this. I know Chase does it, but hey, I'm just a spec. It's I don't got time. Am I right?
I think historically,
They'll say, I want to talk about the risk in giving you a car loan. That's what I want to talk about. And I'm saying, no, I want to talk about a bigger risk portfolio than that.
So, well, I think that is an accurate that is an accurate brush with which you can paint most mid-size local community financial institutions. So yes, I think that is the credit union of yesterday. That is a fair characterization. But I think that today the entire world has woken up to this concept of data as the currency of the future. Every institution needs to get a handle on their data, and the institutions that don't are just going to get left behind, and they're not going to survive. And so, we thought that it was a profound concept of stating that data is the currency of the future. It actually goes one step further than that. It's not just about getting your data into one place, because that's table stakes. And I think most credit unions get that now. It's about extracting value from that. And so, being able to say, not only do I have my data in one place, but what does it mean? Am I making sense out of it? The business we acquired is a kind of a data management platform that really focuses on the extraction of value from that data. And we think that is what is absolutely critical for a local credit union to survive, because, as you said, right, the Navy Federals, right, the Penn Feds, the Chases, the largest players in the financial institution space are looking for every opportunity to win a market and take over a market. The way that local credit union survives is saying, I know my local market better than anyone. And I am going to now harness the power of the data I have around my local market so that I can compete with those large institutions, because they don't know my market as well as I know my market. So I think that the days of sticking your head in the sand and saying, no, I'm not going to pay attention to that, those days are long gone. And you have to get your hands around your data. You have to extract value from it. And you have to use it to make risk-informed decisions.
Well, personally, I think credit unions are in a much riskier world than they were 20 or 30 years ago. For instance, they're competing against kinds of entities they didn't even know would come to exist, like neobanks and non-banks. It's a lot of young people think Venmo is their bank, and it kind of functions like one for some of them. Who would have thought? No, it's a community bank down the street that's my competitor. No, man, not really. That's just one of many.
It is, right? My kids, this summer open up a savings account with an institution that is domiciled halfway across the country, that has a digital platform, and they were agnostic to geographical proximity. And so, right, the days of ignoring that are going to put institutions out of business. So you have to adapt. You have to look for opportunities, and you have to make risk-informed decisions. So yes, I'm with you that I don't think that institutions can survive that way anymore. Which is why I say yes, I will acknowledge that years ago that probably was a strategy, if you want to call it, which was just ignore it. But I think that today what we're seeing is more and more credit unions and kind of local institutions are saying, I need to pay attention to risk. I need to pay attention to my data in order to survive, because the geographical moat, which existed in the past, that's no longer a moat. That no longer keeps people out of your mom and pop business down the street. Your fair game to any of those neobanks and other fintechs that are out there that are trying to win your business.
What kind of fees would you ask from a credit union?
Our scheme is to try and make this as easy as possible to get out of the starting gate. So if you're looking at our data management solution, we don't have any implementation fees on that. We try and use that as a way to get that stood up, and we commit to getting value in the hands of the credit union within 30 days of getting that data management system in place. The risk management component that sits on top of that, you can take that out of the box and you can take the pre-configured version of that. That also has no implementation fee. And so for a smaller institution that wants to realize value quickly, right, we're trying to make that as frictionless as possible with an annual license fee that sits on the back of that. For the larger institution or the institution who's become, grows in maturity over time, there might be some more configuration. There might be some unique KRIs that are personalized for that institution, or that they want us to help them create some reports that are personalized. So then there's some more implementation work that goes into that. But for the most part, we can get out of the starting gate within 30 days and get people to realize value right away. And our view is that we want this to be a license fee that is budgetable and plannable each year. It's not something that is transaction based that fluctuates up and down with the market. So those are the concepts, right? A license fee that really is tied to the maturity of the organization, and then ideally, right, as little implementation kind of upfront fee as possible, especially if you can take something that comes right out of the box.
So what's the range of those numbers?
It's going to be for a very small institution. It can be as low as $5,000 a year to get out of the starting gate with a simple risk management package, and then it'll move up to six figures if you're a larger institution and you're using a full data management platform and the full risk platform on the back of that. So it really does it does vary, but right, we're trying to make this as easy, because look, if I come back to fundamentally why we exist, right? And this might sound like a bit of a platitude, but small businesses are the lifeblood of this country. Those businesses are powered historically by community and local credit unions and sometimes banks, right? Those credit unions are now confronting competition from these large national institutions. We believe that in order to be successful, those local credit unions need the same tools or similar tools to those regional, national, and global institutions. And so that's why we're trying to make this as easy as possible for a credit union to get out of the starting gate, to get the system in place, right? We talked about it earlier, to get off the notebook, off the shared spreadsheet, into a system that has those things like auditability, transparency, right, visibility, and the ability to share information. So we try and make it as easy as possible.
Where does the conversation start for you with a credit union? What title does that person have?
It could be, I'll say, one of three roles, if you will. It'll often start with the CEO, because ultimately the CEO wants to connect risk and strategy, right? You went back to that point earlier of strategic decisions. So oftentimes it starts with the CEO that says, I've established a culture of risk. We have, right, we understand our appetite as an organization, as an institution, but we're not doing a great job of tracking, right, where we are versus that appetite. Can you help us? And so it can start with the CEO, and she or he could bring us in and ask us to work with a CFO or a credit officer. Or in some of the more mature organizations, we'll end up talking to a risk officer or an enterprise risk management leader, or sometimes even at the board risk committee level. So kind of scenario one is the CEO says, we've got a culture of risk and I want systems to back that up. Or it'll be kind of maybe the other way was the bottom up way, which is the risk officer or someone with an area of risk responsibility that says, I'm doing this myself. It's manual. It's laborious, right? I want this to be automated. I want to spend my time evaluating results rather than spending my time collecting data and doing the more mundane and pedestrian bit. I want to spend my time thinking about hindsight, insight, and foresight. I don't want to spend my time thinking about data ingestion and data transformation and data delivery. I want a tool set to do that, a platform to do that.
What's the size range of credit unions that you would see as ideal customers for you?
I'll answer that, Robert, but I'm going to give you another dimension, which is really more about the maturity of the organization, or where the organization, where the institution, where that credit union is going on their journey. And so, I was speaking to an institution recently that said they had grown from, oh boy, I think it was, 200 million in assets up to 350 million in assets over a very tight period of time. That's someone that said, we recognize that we are growing at a really fast pace. We're probably taking on risks that we might not be aware of. In that instance, while I'd say that maybe kind of the 250 to 500 million dollar asset range is where we see institutions starting to work with us. You might be at the low end of that, but if you have a trajectory or a plan to grow quickly, then you want some tools that you'd like to put in place. At the higher end, though, right, you'll where you're more likely to use our to configure our solution and personalize our solution, you're going to be right north of $1 billion, north of 10 billion, even north of $20 billion in assets. So we have a couple of particularly large institutions that we work with, but I'd say that the sweet spot for us is probably the 500 million to a couple of $1 billion. That's when we can add the most value, because folks are typically at that point transitioning from a spreadsheet or a shared document to wanting more of a robust system in place.
Below 500 million, it's often difficult to find the staff on the credit union to work with you. It's not that they don't want to, they don't have the time to. 500 million, you begin to see some people with some capabilities where they could make some time to do a project like this. So
you hit the nail on the head there, though, which is why we think it's particularly important to make this as easy to get out of the starting gate as possible. And so those, that fast track ERM program that I mentioned, the fast track program is designed to get the credit union out of the starting gate quickly and easily. So no implementation fee, connected to the the NCUA call report, a set of pre-configured key risk indicators, and a set of pre-configured reports. So there are, I think, 4 data inputs that we need, and that you could pull those in on a quarterly basis. It's a pretty light lift, if you will, to get rolling. And so yes, I hear you. I agree with you. It is about making it as easy a decision as possible and as easy to enact as possible, because frankly, even if you're a 200, $300 million credit union, there's value in having this type of visibility and intelligence into what your risk profile is as an institution.
Oh, definitely. Those institutions could be facing existential crisis without even being fully aware that they've entered that universe.
Yeah, they likely have siloed data. They're not looking at it holistically. And so if there is an issue, right, it's it might not be bubbling up to the CEO or the chief credit officer or compliance officer or the risk committee, if there is a risk committee. So yes, it's really important to shine a light on that, and ideally to do it in a way where it's easy for the credit union to make that decision to utilize the tool set.
Now, here's a question I often ask technology companies these days is, do you find a credit union saying, geez, I'm pretty sure that I can solve all these problems if I just learn to use ChatGPT. So I don't know why I'm talking with you. And you could say, well, it ain't going to work. You're probably right about that. But there are people who believe that ChatGPT can solve any problem. You just have to learn to prompt.
I spoke at a risk forum last week on the topic of AI. And I referred to 2 examples of risk use cases. The first was an example where the institution works with a handful of vendors today, and as part of their vendor management program, they receive audited financial statements from those partners. And the risk officer said, I don't have any CPAs on my risk team. So how the heck am I going to make sense of these financial statements? Why don't I use AI to evaluate and understand these financial statements? Makes all the sense in the world, right? Then Steve's risk team is looking at those results and they're interpreting those results. So there is a situation where the risk experts are putting their expertise to work, but they're getting the scale that comes from using technology. Another scenario was from an institution that was implementing the Watchtower ERM platform recently. And for their 100 or so key risk indicators that they were looking to set up, they wanted to make sure that they had a consistent definition for each of those risk indicators. And so Joel went out and used an AI aid to help him write the risk definition. And as you said, right, he prompted it, he asked it for a risk definition. It came back with pages and pages, and he then iterated, right, revised his prompts and said, no, I only want these 5 areas, and then I want these 5 areas to operate kind of within these guideposts. And then he said, all right, great, I'm comfortable with that format. Now apply this to these other, 50, 60, 70, 80 key risk indicators I have. And then he had descriptions drafted for those 80 to 100 KRIs instantaneously. Then he spent his time reviewing and personalizing and refining. And so I am all in on the use of AI. I think that there are use cases are pervasive. In Joel's case, he said he would have had to have gone to his CFO and asked for budget to hire someone in order to do this work. And instead, he used AI to get him results back within minutes, if not hours. And then he did the work to personalize on top of that. He saved his budget, and he's going to go back to his CFO later in the year when he has something that he needs that he now can't use AI for. And so maybe it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think those are 2 very specific examples where AI absolutely plays a role. But it didn't get either of them all the way across the finish line. It got them somewhere between 80, 90, 95% of the way there, but there was still a level of interpretation and evaluation and analysis and personalization that needed to be put over the top, because Joel uniquely understood the culture of his organization and the history of what he had asked the Enterprise Risk Management Committee to think about and to consider in the past. And so, look, maybe we're going to get farther and farther down the line, and maybe 80% becomes 95 or 95 becomes 99%. But for now, there absolutely is a role for AI. It should be considered, right, within the right, with the right controls, but it certainly should be used from a by risk managers and in risk management programs, without a doubt.
Funny that you mentioned controls, but AI does bring its own set of risks, which often are overlooked in many institutions. Most credit unions seem to have some vague awareness that there's risk.
It is an area where, right, I say that you've got to start by going to your information security officer and your risk officer. You have to start there, get them engaged. You then need an AI policy, right? And you need controls to monitor usage. And then really to get the most out of it, you've got to iterate and continue to refine and get better and learn it and so forth. But it absolutely begins by understanding the risks associated with it, right? There's some basic principles like the fact that you don't ever want your data to leave your organization, your 4 walls, right? There's lots of great AI tools out there from large providers, whether it's Microsoft or Amazon or whoever, where they will allow you to take some of their capabilities, whether it's Copilot or Q, and they'll kind of drop that inside your container, so your data doesn't ever need to leave your environment. You certainly never want your customer data or your sensitive data to be out there, in a public chat GPT forum. But there's ways to set up your private environments and have the right controls in place. And so I think done correctly, right, with the right security and privacy and controls, it can be incredibly valuable. But I think the starting point is to go to your information security officer, go to your risk officer, understand what your policy is, and certainly under no circumstance do you ever want to put your sensitive data out there in the public domain.
Before we go, think hard about how you can help support this podcast so we can do more interviews with more thoughtful leaders in the credit union world. What we're trying to figure out here in these podcasts is what's next for credit unions. What can they do to really make a difference in the financial scene? Can't all be mega banks, can it? It's my hope it won't all be mega banks. It'll always be a place for credit unions. That's what we're discussing here. So figure out how you can help. Get in touch with me. This is rjmcgarvey@gmail.com. Robert McGarvey again. That's rjmcgarvey@gmail.com. Get in touch. We'll figure out a way that you can help. We need your support. We want your support. We thank you for your support. The CU 2.0 podcast.